Okay. Let's get started. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Debra Klamen. Dr. Klamen is professor and chair of the Department of Medical Education at SIU School of Medicine. She's also senior associate dean for education and curriculum. Until 2003, she was the director of undergraduate medical education and psychiatry at UIC, and she was associate dean for curriculum there as well. Dr. Klamen is Illinois native, and she earned her bachelor's degree at UIC in Champaign and her medical degree at University of Chicago Princess School of Medicine. She is a fellow psychiatrist who completed her training at UIC in Chicago, and she is chief resident. She has also been interested in public health, and she's completed the Master of Health Professionals Education at the University of Illinois in 1998. Dr. Klamen is a very well-known figure in the field of medical education. She has written numerous articles on medical school education, especially in performance evaluation and assessment. She's spoken extensively on stress management for physicians around the country for several years, and actually that was here at least 15, 20 years ago when to give similar presentation. At present, her interest includes development of curricula for medical schools in the area of patient safety, including earlier clerkships, and she has been responsible for several curricular changes at SIU. And SIU is, as many of us know, is a national figure and the forefront of education and curricular change. So I'm so pleased to welcome my friend.
Thank you, Newton. Can you all hear me okay? All right, I had to look at my watch. Good afternoon. So when Newton invited me to come and talk to you all about organizational change and curricular change and its barriers and et cetera, the first thought that came to my mind is how many gray hairs does it take to change a curriculum? So that is the theme of my talk. We are just about, as in next week, to kick off a brand new, quantitatively and qualitatively different third year in our medical school. And so I'm going to be using that experience as the substrate to talk to you about curricular change. Hello. Well, it worked 2 minutes ago. All right. Update is ready to install. There. All I needed was Tina standing up here beside me, so don't go far. All right, so the goals of today's talk are to talk to you about the change that we've just completed at SIU School of Medicine, which, as I said, is the new year 3. We call it Y3T or Y3 transition. The process of change and lessons learned, the little sign over here, the little smiley faces kind of illustrate for you what it looked like. I won't say we're at new stability yet because our kickoff is next week, but I'm hoping in 30 days to say now we're at the level of new stability. And I put this quote up because this is what it feels like, at least to me, that your hardest times lead to the greatest moments in your life. Keep the faith, it'll be worth it in the end. So, to understand the context of change, you obviously have to look at your own school because every school is different. In the context of SIU, in one way, change is easier to accomplish because we have a long tradition of embracing change and innovation. It's sort of what we're built on. Dr. Moy became our first chair at the medical school when it opened in 1970. He was then a 40-year-old University of Chicago grad who opened his mouth, per his words, one too many times and got assigned to medical school about why medical school needed to change. So we're built on that idea. However, there were a couple things that made it harder. There was a curricular change initiative 4 years before I came called C2000, which merged what was originally a problem-based learning track from a pure traditional track into one track. It did all 4 years at once. It was a disaster in the process change. Now, the outcomes actually ended up pretty nice, but let's just say 4 years later when I got there, everyone was still at war. All right? So it made any kind of change more difficult. In addition, previous to my arrival as well, there'd been a geriatrics initiative that was built upon a grant that was put wholesale into the curriculum literally without many people's permission, especially the students' buy-in, and there was a revolt. So these two issues kind of formed a substrate of making things a little more difficult to change. So let's talk a little bit about what the new year 3 looks like so that you can get a scope of the change that we were working toward. So, and I'm going to give you an idea of what it looks like, and then I'm going to talk to you about the strategy that we use to get it implemented. So the first part of the new year 3 is actually a 3-year program called the Triple C. The Triple C's are critical clinical competencies. They're built around 12 chief complaints that are very, very common, 90% of diagnoses seen in ambulatory and acute care settings. So they're things like headache, back pain, fatigue, dizziness, mood changes. You get the drift. They're generic chief complaints. Every year, the students will have 48 diagnoses underneath that, 4 diagnoses for each chief complaint, and they'll do that iteratively with harder cases in year 1, year 2, year 3, so that by the end they'll have seen 144 total diagnoses under those 12 chief complaints. The idea is to reach competency in clinical reasoning through longitudinal exposure with active engagement, expert role modeling, and deliberate practice. It is fully online. It's a video-based demonstration of history and physical, with student engagement in the clinical reasoning process, and then students click on a link and can see experts reasoning through the case at the same point the students are, and then compare their differential diagnoses with that of the experts, and then you click on through for more history, more physical tests, etc. So it allows students to see experts actually explicitly reasoning, and it allows us to follow their growth in clinical reasoning because as they enter things into the computer, they're developing individualized portfolios. There are uncued comprehensive clinical competency exams at the end of year 1, year 2, and year 3 to watch their progress. These have been beta tested now in 1 year. We're about ready to start our 2nd year, and they've been very successful to date. The new year 3 itself looks like this. There's a 3rd year, 8-month-long core. These are 8 clinical rotations, very immersive, of the 8 specialties you see here. There are no lectures. There are we call them con videos, which are short 8 to 20-minute online lectures that are available to any student at any time. They just pull them up. And there are no shelf exams at the end of each of these 8 rotations. The last 15 weeks of the 3rd year is called the PEP, the Personalized Educational Plan. So what happens is after the first 8 months, the students have a pretty good idea of what they want to go into, or they have a pretty good idea that they've narrowed it down to 2. And so they work with a clerkship advisor who's been working with them throughout the 8 months and design a selective for themselves depending on their interests. So for example, a student who found themselves interested in family medicine could do 15 weeks of family medicine at a rural outpatient family medicine clinic if they desired. A student interested in surgery but having had only 4 weeks of surgery could do all the surgical subspecialties in 15 weeks. However, there are students who may need remediation or who didn't do so well in the clerkships. The PEP also provides opportunities for them to remediate in the third year. And for a few talented individuals, after this whole program is completely rolled out, we expect that they'll be able to graduate after 3 years in medical school. So that's what the new third year looks like. You can see it's a pretty big change from previous third year clerkships. Ours was probably quite the same as yours, very traditional, 8-10 weeks of medicine, 6 weeks of psych, etc. So here's our timeline for change. This was in 2014 and 15, we started working on this CCC program, which, as I said, is online, video-based. It's a program we developed with Parallel Consulting in California, starting to look at logistics. And this year we've spent developing more CCC cases, training advisors and mentors, lots of faculty development, educational retreats. And then, as I said, next week we roll out the new year 3. Now that looks like a pretty short timeline. What you don't see in there is the 4 to 6 years of pre-political planning that went on before the timeline. By the time we got to the timeline, it was all about logistics. And I'm going to talk to you more about the other part of it, because once everybody's on board, the logistics themselves tend to fall in line. So how did this come about? Well, you have to understand that SIU has gone through two LCME site visits in a row with no citations. So we couldn't use the LCME to say, oh, we're broke, we need to get better. Or, oh, we have to come into line with what the LCME wants. And matter of fact, our third year clerkships were doing extraordinarily well in the graduation questionnaire, with it high in the 90% agree in all the answers. But my mindset is, if it ain't broke, make it better. So that is sort of, if I start that sentence, everybody laughs because I've said it so many times. But it basically pushes us toward coming up to the cutting edge. It's not good enough for us to sit in the middle and be happy with it. We want to lead the pack. So I started what's called an ad hoc innovation think tank. We actually call it the 12, XII, mostly tongue-in-cheek because it's held at 12, but also it stands for Extraordinarily Innovative Investigators, which our dean loves to come up with acronyms. So we started asking the question, what does a student coming out of year 3 need to know or be able to do? And that had come from an earlier question of what do a graduating student need to know. And we decided that the experiences in the 4th year were all so very different, we couldn't really figure it out. So we look at the 3rd year. And we threw around ideas and looked at all the goals and objectives of all the clerkships and read the literature and decided one thing they absolutely needed to know how to do at the end of the 3rd year was to begin to develop a differential diagnosis and very early treatment plan, because that's sort of what you do in medical school. And if you can't do that, you certainly can't go on and be an intern eventually. That included there were all sorts of other things like socialize into medicine, figure out what you wanted to do with your life, clinical reasoning, etc. So the CCCs were born from that, and we brought the idea of the CCCs to a subcommittee of our Educational Policy Council after a presentation at an EPC retreat. And it was completely non-controversial to put this in. Why? You can imagine. It's online, doesn't take time from anybody's courses. We weren't asking anyone to develop anything. It was clinical reasoning, which no one's going to argue about, that students don't need to know how to do, right? Completely non-controversial. I'm like, okay, we're on the right track. The rest will be easy. Yeah, So meanwhile, as Newton said, I'm the chair of the Department of Medical Education, and we have a group of PhD educators who are very interested in how curriculum work, how medical students learn, assessment, you name it. So this is kind of what we do. We notice things, we collect things, and then we think about the things that we've collected. So we decided to look at testing our hypotheses that the 3 things we came out with that medical students do in the 3rd year are, 1, they find their people, they figure out what they want to do with the rest of their lives, what specialty they want to go into. 2, they socialize into medicine. They learn how to present cases. They learn how to communicate with the team. They learn how to talk to patients, do initial histories and write-ups, etc. And they learn how to clinically reason. That's what the 3 things we said they did in med school in the 3rd year. So then we asked, well, how do you learn how to clinically reason anyway? It's a pretty difficult, complex skill. And we started to look at what kind of theory backed up what we were thinking. So how are complex skills acquired? Well, we found 2 theories that really brought it home to us about how these complex skills are acquired. One is the work on deliberate practice by Anders Ericsson. He's the guy who said, 10 years, 10,000 hours of practice, and came up with these ideas about what constitutes deliberate practice: a relationship with a mentor, specific individualized expectations of the learner, not just read more, specific observation, specific practice, and then immediate feedback. Okay, so that's how you learn a complex skill. And in the setting of an apprentice model, which is a Lave and Wenger paper called Legitimate Peripheral Participation. So for those of you in the audience who were physicians, medical students in training, let's just say a while ago, like me, you got in a rotation, you sat around, you kind of crossed your arms, and you watched for a while, and then eventually somebody let you do something, and then you got to do a little more, and a little more, and a little more, which is the old apprentice model, right? This is how people from farriers to metal makers learned how to do it. From the outside in, peripheral participation, moving to central participation. So that's how we postulated students were going to learn clinical reasoning. But that's not happening these days. How many of you have ever had to give an evaluation of a student that you don't remember? You had to see a picture. I see some heads nodding. Okay? Students don't stay long enough with one person anymore for that person to actually observe them significantly. And what happens is, instead of this interior spiral to the center, they're observing. They start to move in, and they go to a new rotation. They're observing, start to move in, and they go to another rotation. So they're peripheral the entire time. They never move centrally. In addition, patients have shorter lengths of stay. Faculty and residents rotate more frequently. There's restricted duty hours. There's short relationships, 1 or 2 days sometimes, between students and faculty. Clinical facilities are full of idiosyncrasy and opportunism. So when I was a med student, I didn't see any appendectomies, and my best friend in medical school saw 10. Faculty need pictures of students to remember them at assessment time. They have to start over with each new student, assuming that the student doesn't know anything, because how can you know what the student knows? You don't know where they came from. You don't know where they're going next. So as a risk-averse society, as we should be with patients' lives, we assume they know nothing. And that's actually quite a mismatch with students' needs to get involved and participate. In addition, Petruso wrote an interesting article about why, when you have standardized patient exams, do you almost always have to set the pass rates per class, per patient at 60 to 65%. If you don't, they all fail. Huge numbers of students fail. Why? Because near-random clinical experiences of students do not provide consistent, repeated practice with important clinical cases to achieve minimally adequate performance on these objective performance exams, leading to scoring psychogymnastics to titrate fail rates. All right? So this is how the triple C's were born. We wanted to make sure every student has seen everything we want them to see by the time they're done with third year. In addition, if you looked at the 6 core clerkships and you look at the educational bodies of those particular specialties, you will see that each of them have over 100 goals and objectives in their clerkship for each student to know. And what I'd like to know is, can you name any one student that you could guarantee could do all of them? Could you guarantee that all students will reach them? Of course not. Can you guarantee that even one student will meet them? No. Could you pick one student and even guarantee that they know half of them, a quarter of them? No. You have no idea, because they're random, idiosyncratic experiences. So we know that everyone is learning something, but the content is different from one student to the next, and there's no way to know which student got what, which is why some perform really well on chest pain cases and some perform really well on abdominal pain cases, but you don't know who's seen what, thus the psychogymnastics. So we decided, okay, we have really good clerkships. They give us really great evaluations. The LCME loves us. Let's see if we have a problem here. So Reed Williams, Becky Hoffman, and I did a study looking at using a longitudinal performance exam. And what we looked at is we gave students 2 pencil and paper tests at the beginning of year 1, 2, 3, and 4. One was a diagnostic pattern recognition test. So it said, okay, this series of questions is about abdominal pain. Here's these little vignettes. So you got the vignette, match it to the diagnosis you think it is. That's diagnostic pattern matching. And the other was clinical data interpretation. So you're thinking that this person with abdominal pain may have an ulcer, and you get a history of long-term heavy NSAID use. What does that do to your differential? Does it move it up on the list, down on the list, in or out? What we found, we thought that the growth of clinical reasoning would be highest in the third year. That is not what we found. So this last, let's see if it'll go over here. This last run here is from the beginning of year 3 to the beginning of year 4. And what we found is it was the same at all medical schools that we tested it. We had 5 medical schools, public, private, large, small, PBL, traditional, didn't matter. The growth rate in the third year was either flat or slower than the first and second years. So that's just the diagnostic pattern matching scores. Here's the clinical data interpretation scores. So we went, okay then. Yeah.
When you say clinical data interpretation, could you describe what exactly that means?
So it's how do you take a piece of data and use it to move your differential diagnosis thought up or down?
Like a white blood cell count or something?
Or a piece of history or a piece of physical. Let's see. So you're thinking it might be appendicitis, and the patient has rebound tenderness on exam. What does that do to your differential thought of appendicitis? Move it up, down, or leave it the same? So we were stunned. So were, by the way, the other schools that studied this with us, that this is not at all what we expected. So we started looking further. We run what's called a diagnostic justification questionnaire at the end of students' clinical competency exams. And what that is a short answer paragraph. We say to them, okay, give us your differential diagnosis, and what we want you to do is tell us how you got from your initial differential diagnosis to your final diagnosis by using history and physical and laboratory exams that you got during the course of your interview with the patient. So use pertinent positives and pertinent negatives to make this argument. Now our students see 50 cases, 50 standardized patient cases by the time they've gotten to this exam. We get great reports and residency follow-up of how good our students are, especially clinically, and this is what we found. 9 cases, diagnostic justification exercise, rated by 2 blinded expert judges, 50% of the cases, so that's 315 of 630 cases rated, were judged poor or borderline in clinical reasoning. So we took a long, deep breath. I think I had a couple martinis that weekend, and said, we need a much more rational, less idiosyncratic method for teaching clinical reasoning. And that's how the triple C's were born, as a way to deal with making sure everybody had the same experiences throughout, because it was pretty impossible to build it in the current clinical clerkship environment. Then we did another study called the Socialization study. 2 of our PhDs, Nicole Roberts and Hee-Young Han, literally went out to the clerkships for a year and followed medical students all day long in all the clerkships and documented field notes about what they were doing all day long. Students know that there's a shelf exam at the end of the clerkship, and it is the item most likely to fail them. So 99% of our students who fail the third-year clerkships fail it because of the step exam. So they disappear to study, right? That's not like an apprenticeship. They're gone if they can do it. They showed on average that students were spending 3 hours per day in clinical work. The rest of the time they're hiding, studying, waiting, chatting, chasing down labs, doing a variety of things. So they did find that students were socializing into medicine and they were figuring out what they wanted to do as a career, but they were not learning clinical reasoning on the clerkships. And the longitudinal performance exam data actually supported that. Then I did a coaching study. So coaching, as you know, if any of you have ever been in sports or voice lessons, music lessons, debate, whatever, coaching is the hallmark of making an expert because it uses those items of deliberate practice, observation, immediate feedback, explicit, individualized practice plans. So I got 24 medical students who had said that they'd had extensive coaching experience in either sports or arts or something like that. And I talked to them in qualitative focus groups about what was your experience with coaching. And 5 factors emerged. All of them were identical to the deliberate practice ones I've been talking about, plus noting that a long-term relationship with the coach really helped them in feeling safe enough to talk openly about their problems. And then I asked them about their clerkships. These were 4th-year students. And they came up with the same 5 factors, but they were opposite. Short relationships, not observed, generic goals, generic feedback, and there's one more. You get the drift. They're opposite. Plus, they had a 6th factor, which was about assessment, doing well in the clerkship. So we heard a lot about studying for the shelf, impression management, learning how to answer questions when you don't know the answer to questions, but make it look like you do. Okay? So here's some actual quotes from students. In a coaching situation, the coach's major goal is for you to perform well. In clerkships, the major goal is to impress attendings. We didn't feel that the 3rd year was to build clinical skills. It was knowledge building towards step 2 in a different setting. The clinical got in the way of the study for the shelf. So you can imagine we were beside ourselves, but realized that here was our argument for why we needed to change the 3rd year. And so this is how we did it. The first 3 laws of institutional change are all the same, and I'm sure you're well aware of them. All right? There are people who will not change because change is hard and scary and they don't want to do it. There are people who don't change because change is more work. There are people who won't do it because everything has to be laid out perfectly before I'm going to change anything. And the list goes on and on and on. So here's how we led change. We established a sense of urgency. A lot of schools do this by saying the LCME is mandated that we need to do something. We didn't have that, so we said, look at all this data. We're not doing what we think we're doing in year 3. We've got to do something about it. And I wrote a paper in academic medicine called Embracing the Conditions of the Third-Year Clerkship and Reimagining the Curriculum to Enable Deliberate Practice. Now, notably, that was not my preferred title. That was academic medicine's preferred title. My preferred title was The Emperor Has No Clothes. Then we formed a guiding coalition. So I got the dean on board very early. Kevin Dorsey, who has since retired as dean, is a very strong proponent of education. And I got him on board by showing him all this data and talking to him. Plus, he was a rheumatologist, so he's had experience supervising students in the 3rd year and knows what the change has been like. I got our Department of Med Ed, all those PhD faculty on board and armed with data, because PhDs can argue data like nobody else. Okay? I'm an MD. I have a master's in health professions education, but turn my PhD educators loose to talk about their data, and I can just sit back and smile. Okay? We got the students from the curriculum committees on board. All right? We have a medical student interest group who are interested in medical education, and we showed them all this data and let them help us design a curriculum, and they infiltrated into all the medical school classes about why we needed a change. So everywhere on the curriculum committees, the students were advocating for a change. We got the clerkship directors and the nurse educators on board mostly. So the nurse educators are master's level nurses who are in my employ, who are assigned to each clerkship to help balance the needs of the clerkship versus the central administration and do a ton of teaching with medical students to boot. So they were all on my employ, and I got those on board pretty quickly. Clerkship directors, most of them thought this was a good idea, not all of them. But I talked to each party separately by presenting data and the vision. All right? Because, and I can't emphasize this enough, nothing should ever come up in front of a committee for a vote unless you have a pretty darn good idea who is going to vote for what ahead of time. All right? Because if you come up for a vote in front of a committee and you're voted down, it is hard to come back from. All right? And I know some of you know that experience personally. So I did a lot of behind-the-scenes work before it ever came up for a vote. Political negotiation. It's painful. You need to have creativity coming into it. So how can we work together to solve the problems of this data? Sometimes it doesn't work. There are people who you can present data to until you're blue in the face, and because they don't like you, or because they don't like the change, or because they just are mad at the world, they're not going to listen to data. So we had a lot of EPC, Educational Policy Committee meetings with people saying, well, we don't believe your data. You know, well, your N was 24. How can that be significant? So, we bring in the qualitative researcher and said, we have data saturation, state-of-the-art qualitative research. Well, I don't believe that data. What are you going to do about that? You need a thick skin during personal attacks. So luckily for me in this, I'm a psychiatrist. So I got used to really quickly when somebody would go off and start yelling, I would flip into, okay, you're my borderline personality disorder patient, and how am I going to deal with this? I'm not going to take it personally. Or on more than one occasion, you're my narcissistic personality disorder patient, and how am I going to deal with you in this manner? So you can't take it personally. If you take it personally and you lose your cool, then it's all over. All right? Then it becomes personal. You need to listen, listen, and listen some more. Some of the ideas that came up, I hated immediately. And the more I listened, the more I liked them, and they ended up in the curriculum. You negotiate things away so you can keep the important aspects. So I decided early on what were the basic aspects of this new curricular change that I had to keep, i.e. active learning, immersion in the clerkship, and then negotiated away other topics. So if you could let people chew around the edges a little bit and have a little bit of ownership, it worked to move the whole thing forward. Now, negotiation can stalemate or it can be derailed. And our story is probably not untypical. The Educational Policy Council stalemated for about 3 months. And it stalemated in a very clever manner for the person who was doing the stalemating. On the one hand, we're the group that liked this change and wanted to go ahead with this change. On the other side was the group that said, well, we're not going to really talk about this change. We're going to talk about, do we need to adopt this change or not? So they would just talk about adopting the change. And if you said, well, let's talk about it, they'd say, well, you don't have any details. Well, we can't plan it until you adopt it. So it would stalemate everything. So our dean, a very sweet, compassionate, wants to talk to everybody, wants to get consensus, rarely lays down, this is the way it's going to be, needed to come in and change this. So for 3 months, I met with him and talked to him about the change, talked to him about what the EPC was doing, talked to him about the stalemate, showed him all the data, and literally coached him into coming to an EPC meeting. And I said, your normal collaborative style, not going to work so well here. We're deadlocked. It's not going to happen unless you provide the tipping point. And so at that meeting, we all held our breath because the dean walked in first, sat down, said, I hear you're at a stalemate. Yes. I want you all to stop dicking around and do this now. And, people's jaws dropped to the floor. I'd never even heard him say darn. Okay? This is not a dean who cusses. And so one of the primary opponents of the change said, do you mean this change? Or can we design another change we like better? And he looked straight at her and said, I said, stop dicking around and do this change now. And they got up and walked out. And that was the tipping point. Okay? I took him out for dinner after that. So, once we had the go-ahead, and it was like all speed ahead, then you have to get everybody involved in the work, because it's going to be a lot of work. Any curricular change is a lot of work. So you have to create and communicate a vision. So we had an EPC retreat. We have them yearly anyway. This one was about the new year 3. It had representation from all 4 years of medical school, plus a lot of students, plus a few residents, etc. And we outlined what the curriculum was going to look like and how we were going to move it forward. And we devised an advisory committee with 5 separate subcommittees underneath it to work on the details. So the advisory committee was me and the dean and the chair of all these other subcommittees. The core looked at the first 8 months. The PEP looked at those 15 weeks. The assessment looked at how are we going to assess students during this clerkship. Faculty development was looking at things like how do we teach faculty to be coaches. And program evaluation was looking at how are we going to see if what we're doing is working. On purpose, I put slow and influential adopters on the advisory committee. So people who I knew were slow to adopt this idea or weren't very happy about it, but were very influential in the medical school itself, I put them directly on the advisory committee because I did not want those people spreading misinformation or not knowing what was going on and getting paranoid about it from the beginning. So they were right up front. Okay, you know about how keep your friends close but your enemies closer? That's sort of how it worked out. And it worked a great trick. Armed with data, we had data about everything. We appealed then to clinicians. I went out to all of the clinical faculties department meetings and made a short presentation about the New Year 3 and why it was important. I picked one episode that really got them. So this whole idea of having to evaluate with pictures, they knew that was baloney and they didn't know those students and didn't like that. So that became my rallying cry for clinicians about why we needed to change this. We kept well-informed student advocates on all the subcommittees, and we empowered them to act. So we had several students who would, especially in the core subcommittee initially, who would say things like, faculty would say, well, we need the students to be all together. We shouldn't be assigning them out with preceptors because they're a group, they study together, they're used to that, they need to be that way. And the student was like, that's not what really happens in a clerkship anyway. We're all separate. If we want to talk to our friends, we FaceTime them or we write on Facebook or we tweet. So we don't need to get all together. So they would just, bust open some of those ideas. I attended every single subcommittee. So there were 6 of them that met monthly to prevent derailing. I didn't have to do that for very long once they got going. But in the first couple meetings, it was mass chaos. What are we doing? Where are we going? What decisions can we make? Do we have to do this? Why don't we have to do this? It just went everywhere until people kind of got themselves focused. And my job was to keep them focused. Keep everybody informed. All our meeting minutes were available online, and the students I met in the second year who were going to be the beneficiaries of this, I had monthly meetings that were optional about what do you want to know about the New Year 3. Another way to lead change and to keep up momentum is to plan for and create short-term wins. So we got a Macy grant for this, fairly significant one, enough to hire Parallel Consulting to build our video modules. Notably, because of that geriatric initiatives grant I told you about before, where there was a backlash of, well, you just have money, so you're using it to force something into our curriculum, I didn't apply for the grant until after the change was approved at the EPC, so that no one could say, you're just going after money. Yes, sir. What year we're at? This is now into 14-15. So we're now into the logistics of the change. We reported the progress of each subcommittee. We involved the medical education student interest group. We had faculty development retreats, initiatives, and progress reports. And we actually did some student development. So we were teaching the faculty about being coaches and what that meant, and how to be an advisor and what that meant. And we decided, well, in this age of impression management, we wanted to change our students from acting like they ought to know to being open to saying, I don't know, and they were going to need some help. So the 4th year students in the medical student interest group worked with a faculty member, reviewed the literature, designed a coachability curriculum for the 2nd year students, and delivered it to the 2nd year students themselves. So they were helping the students become coachable. So once the resistance is overcome, for the most part, the rest is logistics. You got to keep an eye on it all so it doesn't derail. It's really easy to get unfocused, to get refocused on, well, why don't we extend this into the 2nd year? Well, what are we going to do about the 4th year? Well, what answers are this or that or the other thing? Once you've got your plan, you've got to work the plan. And so my job, and frankly, I had medical student moles on each of the subcommittees who were highly committed to this change, who kept everybody focused and moving in the right direction. Hurdles, change in general. As I said, change is hard. There were personality mismatches and power struggles. So there was a faculty member at SIU, very influential clinician, who let's just say, has never gotten along well with me no matter what. Didn't really matter what it's about. No matter what I said, this person said the opposite. And got a great deal of joy out of it, I think. Okay? And I had to get okay with the fact that I was not going to be able to convert this person. I never actually did convert this person, and this person retired before needing to deal with this new year 3. All right? You can't adopt this change until we can ensure it will be perfect. Perfection is the enemy of the good. Do we have every single detail worked out? Absolutely not. We're going to have all kinds of unintended consequences that we don't know the answer to. Do we have multiple pipelines down into the third year students to make sure we know what's going on from the beginning? Yes. We've already fixed a couple problems that Eagle Eye students have figured out. I'm taking 8 clerkship advisees from all over the class rank so I can keep an eye on what's going on. MCQ reliance. This was the hardest thing for clinical faculty to give up. We have to give the shelf exam because objective must be better. Well, MCQ exams are not objective. All right, they're selected by people, they're created by people, the choices of the questions asked are created, the choices of the right answer are created. There's tons and tons and tons of subjective steps that make an objective MCQ, but it gives us a number and it makes us all happy campers, right? There's lots of data, including articles by Reed Williams and myself, about how given enough clinical observation is equally as valid and reliable as multiple choice questions. So that was an argument that was very, very difficult. It was actually difficult for the students too. Well, how are we going to study and learn about things and be prepared for step 2 if you don't give us this exam? And a lot of worry about, well, we can't give grades on narratives alone, which started a very interesting study. Our internal medicine director was one of these very slow adopters, but when she said that in one of the curriculum committees, one of our DME faculty members said, well, let's see if we can, and went and took 3 years of data under the old system to look to see if there were actually indicators of what an honors student was versus a failing student versus an average student on narratives alone, and indeed there are. Lessons learned. This will take a pound of flesh. It'll take it from somebody. It may take it from all of you. Change is hard. You need somebody you can vent to. All right? So I used the dean because obviously I couldn't vent to somebody who was on the curriculum committee or the EPC or the students or whatever. We also used to have Department of Med Ed girls' nights out and just, sorry about my language, bitch. That's what we did. We just vented. All right? Because if you don't release it somewhere, it's going to get released in one of those committees, and you're going to blow, and things will polarize, and poof, that's the end of it. Okay? You have to differentiate ignorance about what's going on, wariness about change, from personal attacks. Some people aren't so good at saying, this is a bad idea. They say you're a bad person, and you have to figure out which is which and not act it out. You have to keep alliances and use direct confrontation as necessary. So this is an interesting story. One of the people who was the chair of one of the subcommittees, who I thought was an ally, was accidentally caught on tape at the end of a taped meeting, venting to somebody else with expletive-laden, what a stupid idea this was, what she was going to do about it to make sure it stopped, on and on and on. Well, that happened because my secretary transcribes the tapes. She said, oh my God, you should hear the end of this. And I did, and I took a chill pill for a while, called her in my office and said this was accidentally taped, and it's been erased, and I'm not going to do anything with it, but we need to talk about this. And it was a direct confrontation, and it worked quite well. It was difficult for both of us. but you can't avoid those. So lessons learned, you can do root touch-ups at home and get over and change your curriculum. I want to thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Yes, ma'am. So we have a new online, it's called an on-the-fly form, and every time a student is observed by a faculty member or a nursing staff or a nurse educator, etc., all they do is hit a button, say to the faculty member, can you give me some feedback, and they just dictate directly in. They hit submit, it gets sent centrally, and all of those data and comments get sent to the clerkship director at the end of the clerkship, who uses those narrative comments to assign a grade. Some of the clerkships have also elected to do some clinical exams, so they'll do like on-call pages. Hi, Dr. So-and-so, we have a patient in surgery right now who's just dropped her blood pressure. Here's some data. What do you want to do? And they get evaluated on that too. Yes, sir.
Early in the presentation, when you were talking about the third year, you mentioned there were no lectures involved, only videotapes that the students could access. I think you said 15, 20 minutes long.
Correct.
Did you create those yourself, or did you find them, like you mentioned, the faculty produced them?
Yeah, it's a combination. So faculty produced a bunch. There are some online things that we have links to, like Adam Sepp has stuff for psychiatry. And we also bought the series of MedU cases that have like simple cases, wise cases from all different specialties. So
students know how to access them and when to use them.
Yes, and students from year 1 through year 4 can assess them all, any of them at any time. Yes, sir.
So I have two questions. The first question is, what type of grading do you do with them in your
Pass-fail honors. Yep.
So you don't have a number for it.
No. And we never have. We didn't change that.
The other question is that when you're looking at the development of the students, you assess them at year 1, year 2, year 3, early on, and you didn't see very much progress. What I don't understand is that during year 3, you're studying for step 2, and they must be doing differential diagnosis and other things. What are they learning for step 2 if it isn't what you're assessing?
Right.
Yeah, those questions.
I think they're learning clinical factoids.
They're not doing differential.
I mean, they have to do some differential, obviously, because step 2, when I write questions for right. I write questions for step 2. Yeah. They're not doing differentials in the way that you're thinking. So they will present a case, and you have to use the details from the case to answer the question. But they're not saying, okay, show us your reasoning. They're basically saying, pick the right answer. And because there's only 5 options for the most part, they cue fairly significantly what it is they're doing. So like I take step 2, CK, yearly as a matter of course, just to see what kind of questions are on there. I'm a psychiatrist. I haven't done anything else but psychiatry and med ed administration for a long time now, and I still get really good scores on that because they're so cued that you have a 20% chance of getting the answer right even before you start. It was extended matching, so they could have up to 20 options. Yeah. Yeah.
Did you have to deal with faculty that were not, we have a lot of clinical faculty that are on our faculty, aren't really paid by us, they're at community hospitals.
Right.
So was that a special group that was difficult? And sort of related to that, we have also many students that are at hospitals where they're teaching other medical school students from different schools.
Mm-hmm.
So we've always wondered how tricky it might be if we change the third year, but the other schools didn't. How could we get faculty at those sites that might be teaching students from 3 different schools internal medicine to do something special for our internal medicine that they weren't doing for those other schools?
Well, we don't have a lot of competition with other medical schools.
You don't have that overlap where your students are at.
We do have some. We do have some allopathic students. We have PAs and nurses, etc. But with the on-the-fly form and students that are taught what the on-the-fly form says was, what did you observe today? What did the student do well? What did the student need to work on? That's it. Oh, and if you don't want to narrate, you can go through a whole long checklist of things and pick what they did or didn't do. So even our preceptors out in the community, and we have a bunch of those, basically the student's been coached how to use it. The student hands them this and says, can you fill this out? I'll show you how. And so far in the pilot, they haven't had any trouble with that. Yeah. Who's the most honest? Oh, we don't know yet because it hasn't gone live. The interesting thing about it is there was a great sense of relief by the faculty when they were learning how to do coaching that the assessment of the student is actually taken out of their hands. They can't say the student has failed, the student has passed, the student has anything. They just write what they observe. And because of that, they're much more likely, we hope, to just say what they observe because it's an amalgamation of data and they don't assess pass-fail. When I was the psych clerkship director at UIC some number of years ago, I did the same thing. I took the pass-fail rating system away from the preceptors, did it centrally, and got a lot more negative data that I was probably missing before. Yes, sir. And then you, ma'am. 72. I know. It's nuts. It used to be 190 at UIC. Yes, ma'am.
So, does the scenario run through for each individual student? How does that work?
Talking about the triple C's?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's 3 levels, level 1, level 2, level 3. They're labeled that way instead of first year, second year, third year because we invite students, they have to do them in order. They have to do all 12 level 1s before they can do level 2s, but they can do them level 1, level 2, level 3 in their first year if they want to. It develops an individualized portfolio. They have to do all the cases in level 1 by the end of year 1, level 2 by the end of year 2, etc. But you can, if they do it multiple times, you can actually see the record each time. And so we can track how well they reason across the 3 years. It runs, they can do any of them in any order they want. However, they know that those unqueued standardized patient exams at the end of year 1, year 2, and year 3 are only on those 12 chief complaints. So they know it's in their best interest to do them. They also know that there are standardized patient exams at the end of each unit. So we have a unit, cardio-renal respiratory. They know that those cases at the end are going to be on chief complaints, so they all go do the chest pain and shortness of breath cases during CRR, but we don't tell them they have to do that. It's coordinated with blocks if the students want it to be coordinated with blocks. It doesn't have to be. Well, the curriculum in year 1 has 3 blocks. The curriculum in year 2 has 4 blocks. The students have to do 12 in year 1 and 12 in year 2, but they can do them whatever order they want. But because they know that they're assessed at the end of the unit on probably certain chief complaints, they link them, but they don't have to. That was a long, long debate about what we wanted them to do. Yes, sir.
I am from the PA department. I wanted to see if there was any thought about integrating any of the
Actually, as part of the grant, right now there's 1 long case and 3 mini cases. There'll be 4 and 5 mini cases, which will all deal with interprofessional content. We do have a PA school in Carbondale, and if they want it, they can have it. Matter of fact, if you want it, you can have it. It's free to everybody. We're still in beta testing, though, right now, so it's not released widely. But, yeah, there's no reason. Hey, Barb, how you doing?
Hi. I just wanted to say, my name is Barb Gilbert, and I'm the director of the Standardization program here. I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Klamen at UIC, and she did a whole overhaul of the first and second year curriculum when I was there, the essential for clinical medicine, and it was amazing. And she had lots
And it's still there.
Yes, it is still there. It's still running all these years later. And she had a lot of resistance from faculty and other people, and but it worked, and it's very successful. And I will listen to everything.
Thanks, Barb. I got it. It's right here. This is one reason I like this thing.
I don't blame you.
Because it can't go anywhere.